to this MP Watch webinar, which we're very pleased to be rolling out on this Tuesday morning. We feel very lucky to have Simon Oldridge talking to us about a report that he did for 0 Hour. Simon is a former business consultant with Ernst & Young, and he draws on his experience in analysing complex business systems to help communicate the climate and nature crisis. The report that he's talking about, he co-authored with Jane King, and it's called the Ambition Gap Report, which looks at the UK's net zero strategy. And it's been reviewed and endorsed by leading scientists, including our friend Mike Berners-Lee and Kevin Anderson, the very well-known and rather wonderful scientists. And many physical copies have been sent to all MPs and active peers. So I'll hand over to you, Simon. Thank you for being here and for doing this for us.
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks very much to everyone for coming along. I should just add that I've worked closely with scientists at 0 Hour for the last few years, but I've stepped back recently to focus more on achieving climate action through political change, with 0 Hour being a cross-party organisation. Look at the headlines in the mainstream media, and the UK's made serious progress on climate change, cutting territorial emissions by nearly 50% since 1990. But, you know, you scratch beneath the surface and that picture looks far less rosy. We agree, 0 Hour agrees with the government in that their assertion here from their net zero strategy that moving above 1.5 degrees is incredibly risky. So the government are quite frank about this. I mean, that's a very clear statement, and it's correct. But you speak to Conservative MPs and they just don't seem to get it. My MP proudly asked me to name a single European country that had installed more wind capacity than us. Well, on watts per capita, which is the only fair measure, we're about halfway down the list. But more importantly, this isn't a nationalist competition. We're in a race against physics. He also told me that the net zero strategy goes further than ever before. And undoubtedly it does. But unless we actually do what the scientists say is necessary, we're heading for real disaster. So this talk focuses on the yawning gaps that need addressing between our current targets and what's really necessary to avoid the worst of climate change. The IPCC called for rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, but you only have to look around you and it's largely business as usual. You know, there's no roads, there's a scaffolding all the way down them. We're not seeing much on EV chargers or any serious honesty about climate change from the government. So I'm going to touch on how climate and nature are completely interwoven and why the net zero strategy won't deliver the transformative policies necessary because it doesn't properly acknowledge this relationship, how the UK's targets are out of date, how we're overlooking the cheapest, quickest way to cut emissions, which is reducing energy use, and we're very bad on that in this country, how some of the technological solutions on offer just cannot deliver and why. And why cutting emissions is actually only half the story. And that's where my colleague, my fantastic colleague, Jane King at 0 Hour really lifted my knowledge. There's a whole story around nature and why that's necessary to limit warming. And then looking at our global footprint, the UK has a huge ecological and emissions footprint overseas. And then most frustratingly, how we're missing a huge opportunity for a positive future, you know, as well as the enormous savings we can get from decarbonising and electrifying everything. And one study talks about savings of over 60% for the country on energy. If we follow the science, we can help save our rivers, clean our air, end the suffering that comes with cold, damp homes, boost jobs, relieve the burden on the NHS. There's just such a long list of positives. It's not just about averting catastrophe. And we're being held back by inertia and the deliberate action of the fossil fuel industry to prevent change. So here's a quick graphic that just sort of sets the overall scene. In the middle there, you see the UK's 5-yearly carbon budget, our carbon targets. climate targets. The current direction in the emissions projections that the government put out last year looked pretty much like that line at the top. Recently, we've had the Energy Security Day policies, which purport to have closed that gap, according to the government. But you listen to the scientists and you start poking around in the detail, and there is a lot of nonsense in there about carbon capture, blue hydrogen, and the like. So there's a very big question mark about how much that gap has been closed. And that's a lot of people are looking at that at the moment. But what this talk is about is the ambition gap, the gap between our existing targets, which we're trying to come back in line with, and what's really necessary for 1.5 degrees. Now, I know we're right on the edge of 1.5 degrees, and there's a question about whether it's even, that's gone now. But I don't think it's time to be changing our target. There's so much brand awareness of 1.5 degrees. And I do think it's still possible for the UK to keep to its share of the cuts necessary for 1.5 if we genuinely treated this as an emergency. But that's perhaps up for a discussion later. So our report gives equal weight to climate and nature. It's a really important point in this. Climate change damages nature. At the same time, biodiversity loss amps up climate change, degrading nature's capacity to absorb and store carbon or to adapt to the impacts of global heating. So this talk is in two sections. So first of all, emissions reductions. Quickly skirt through that one. But first, a quick explainer on net zero dates and carbon budgets. This is the sort of reduction curve that the IPCC called for, because when looking at CO2, warming is driven by cumulative emissions, and the CO2 is building up all the time, so we just need to cut emissions rapidly now to buy ourselves time to handle the more difficult challenges later. But this is the broad approach being taken by most developed nations, or being promised, because they'll never achieve that final rapid reduction just by, they're essentially putting everything off until tomorrow, including the UK. And you can see in scenario 2 there, we're still, coming into net zero at 2050, but the emissions along the way are twice as high, and that's twice the amount of warming. So we've really got the wrong language being used in the media and amongst politicians. It's not about net zero dates, it's about the path we take. So targets, first of all, these are the UK's carbon budgets, and they're really out of date. The one that we're entering at the moment, the fourth carbon budget, was set 12 years ago. The fourth and fifth carbon budgets predate the UK's net zero by 2050 commitment. And so they don't provide a steep enough ramp down to where we need to get to. They also predate the IPCC's special report on just how important 1.5 degrees is. We've learned a lot, science has learned an awful lot over the intervening period, and these targets should have been changed to reflect that new knowledge. So they're out of date. There are serious emissions. The fourth and fifth carbon budgets exclude international aviation and shipping, our share of it, until 2033. And we can't just pretend those emissions aren't going up into the atmosphere. They are. All the targets, even through to the sixth carbon budget, exclude blue carbon. That's carbon stored in marine ecosystems. And so we're ignoring the huge impact of industrial fishing, like bottom trawling, which has similar CO2 emissions to global aviation. And these targets all treat, our emissions reporting all treats the burning of wood, bioenergy, like a Drax power station, as carbon neutral. It's not even included in the figures. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then there are some ludicrous mathematical contortions. Let me just admit a new guest. Welcome. There are mathematical contortions going on here in the assertion that these targets are 1.5 degree compliant, because that's what the government says, that's what the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, have said. But in order to say that, they make this crazy assumption that if we cut emissions at this pace, and that if all the rest of the world cut emissions at this pace, we'll achieve 1.5 degrees. Now that completely ignores the fact that poorer nations are going to see emissions rise as they climb out of poverty, and with a fair bit of population growth locked in places like Africa. So they're just denying reality there to say other countries will cut as fast. They also use a carbon budget with a 50% chance of success, a roll of a dice for our future. So really the targets are not fit for purpose. And just quickly, the fifth carbon budget there is 36% too high for our Paris commitment. So we have no domestic legislation that would that creates any sort of legally binding obligation to meet our Paris agreement commitment for 2030. Then there's the elephant in the room. We have no targets to reduce our imported emissions, but the UK has offshored more manufacturing than almost any country. Those emissions obviously haven't been eliminated, they've just moved elsewhere. And so as the largest net importer of CO2 per capita in the G7, that's a real issue. We can't just pretend these emissions don't exist. Last year there was much in the press about being halfway to net zero. You can see a 48% drop there. But when we add the emissions caused by the goods we import with aviation and shipping, our total reduction in our carbon footprint is only 23% over that period. Now that's less than 1% a year. It's about 0.7% a year. That's incremental. That's not transformational. And it's just worth quickly showing there's a sort of sector by sector view of UK territorial emissions from 2010. And you can see it's a real story of flatlining and not much happening outside power. So there's really not much to congratulate ourselves about. And actually, I have to say, a lot of that power reduction is coal plants shutting down. All of which means that under the net zero strategy, we UK citizens can expect to emit on average more than twice our share of the global carbon budget for a 67% chance of 1.5 degrees. And that's with an optimistic interpretation. The 49 tons you see there is how 0 Hour calculated the per person share of the global carbon budget. So that's how much any one person in the world can emit from 2020 all forever until we reach net zero. 49 tons. We're heading for like at least 110 now, and so there's a big reduction to be made there. Now in the UK, it's worth noting that Oxfam show the top 1% of people are emitting more than 49 tons every year, and so there's a real story about inequality here that needs tackling. Energy use then. We waste so much energy unnecessarily. Academics at the Centre for what was it called again? Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, CREDS, and they're based at Oxford Uni in Leeds, have shown that the UK could cut its energy use by over 50% with no detrimental impact on the quality of life. Actually, would make it better. And one of the biggest offenders is home heating. And you can see there on the top left, that chart, that's number of degrees of heat loss over 5 hours in homes around Europe. And that comes from a huge sample from this smart heating control supplier. So they've got data feeding coming from everyone's home. And you can see that UK homes are losing 3 times as much energy than German homes. And that's thanks to really poor building standards, which little has been done about. And you can see at the bottom right there, we were starting to act on that, and then we had the cutting the green crap from the Cameron government, which has really slowed things down. The heat pump grant's nowhere near well enough funded. It pays £5,000 or £6,000. That's just not enough to persuade people to act. Insulation grants are about £1,000. That's far too low. Italy pays 110% of the cost to retrofit your home, insulation and heat pump, up to €100,000. And that's because they recognise that there is a really big saving to be had, and that the only way to get the market going is to persuade, give people, fund it for people so they'll act. We're also building far too many homes. The construction of a typical new home releases around 50 tons of CO2. So that's one person's lifetime allowance. We have around 1.2 million empty homes in the UK. We should be doing a lot more to bring those back into operation. and have fewer homes being built and redirect those that labour force onto retrofit. A recent study has shown that housing alone and on the current direction is going to use up 48% of the UK's carbon budget. Transport, we're stalling at best. There's no incentive to reduce car journeys. Large gas guzzlers are proliferating with no action on that. We've cut tax on domestic flights. So we're moving in the wrong direction here. Airports have expansion plans. And then moving on to negative emissions technology. Here's you can see on this chart shows emissions reduction pathways from the Climate Change Committee. Down at the bottom there, you can see the dotted line shows the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere by negative emissions technologies. And you can see that by 2050, that's reaching the same scale, roughly, about 60 million tons, as today's entire manufacturing and construction industry. So we have this enormously expensive plans to reduce carbon, rather than actually just getting on with cutting carbon out of the atmosphere today. But you look at these plans in more detail, and then you find out that that they aren't even going to work. They aren't even going to achieve this. So there are two main technologies. There's BECCS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and there's DACS. I'll come to in a minute. So BECCS builds on the Drax converted coal power station in Yorkshire. And our report shows that numerous show-stopping problems, which mean that it just can't deliver on its claims. The fundamental premise that burning wood is carbon neutral because forest regrowth will relock up that carbon is completely flawed, because woodland takes around 50 years to reabsorb the carbon, and possibly worse. UK emission reporting doesn't include these emissions from Drax, despite the fact that they've been shown to be clear-cutting forests. So that's a one-off release of carbon and a reduction in the number of trees continually absorbing carbon, just as we're heading into tipping point territory. And then, of course, you've got the damage that it inflicts on nature and the competition for food. UK BECCS plans require an area almost the size of Wales, according to one of our scientists, Dr. Paul Behrens. So it's utterly ludicrous, and Drax should be shut down. But these things develop a life of their own. DACS is direct air capture with carbon storage. It's a very high energy process, sucking CO2 out of the air, and because the percentage of CO2 in the air is actually very low, it uses a lot of energy to filter those molecules out, pumps them down underground, bonds them to rock. But the problem is that because it uses a lot of energy and we don't yet have 100% renewables, that simply drives the output of, increases the output of a gas power station. So what you pull out of the atmosphere in one hand, you just put back in the other, roughly. DACS is a promising technology, and it's very likely to have a role in the future to bring CO2 levels down to safer sort of numbers, to clear up after our historical damage. But it shouldn't be used as a means to offset ongoing fossil fuel burning, which is what the government's trying to do with it. Methane. The UK currently, well, not just methane and others. The government currently bundles other greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, etc., together with CO2, and they do it in a way that underestimates the impact of these powerful warming gases. So they don't get the focus they should. Methane's the most significant, and it surprises people to hear, unless they know, that of the 1.2 or 3 degrees of warming seen to date, methane is responsible for 0.5 degrees of that. So it's very significant. It's not just a tiny add-on. And scientists are worried about this sort of uptick that we're seeing lately in atmospheric methane concentrations. And there's some reasons for that, but I won't go into that now. It needs a lot more focus. Now, unlike CO2, methane has a very short, let me just catch up there. It has a very short, sharp effect on warming. And you can see that red line there shows the impact of a pulse of methane theoretically reduced in released in 2010. It has most of its impact within about 15, 20 years and then falls away. It's broken down. But UK reporting and international, this is the standard, treats methane as if that effect was spread evenly over 100 years. They sort of amortize it. And it gives the illusion that methane is having a much lesser effect over that critical point. And this way of treating methane is just no longer fit for purpose when we now know the serious danger of crossing tipping points. We need to treat methane in a different way. And there are two ways of doing it. You can treat it over 100 years, or there's a factor for 20 years. So you can see there that you multiply methane by 25 times to find out its equivalent warming impact compared to CO2, and that's how the government does it. But it's actually 83 times more potent over 20 years. So we're ignoring that. But there's a positive story here too. There's an opportunity. Because methane does disappear quite quickly, if we cut methane much faster now, one study shows that we could shave 0.3 degrees off the warming we're heading for. Not saying we're going to have, end up with lower temperatures, but just less high than we otherwise would. So the UK has signed the Global Methane Pledge, but it's not backing up with policies. Alternative fuels, so hydrogen's a really big issue. First of all, hydrogen, if you burn it in oxygen, creates water. It's super pure. But if you burn it in air, it creates dangerous NOx pollution, worse than gas boilers. There's a risk of explosion, and it's far more costly to heat a home with hydrogen than it is with a heat pump, because heat pumps are so efficient. You've got two sorts here. Well, grey hydrogen, first of all, is how we make hydrogen now, and you make it from methane. There are these two supposedly clean options. Green hydrogen is clean, with a proviso. It's made from water, and if you use renewable power, and you're not diverting that renewable power from displacing fossil fuel generation, then it's clean. But it's very expensive. It's energy efficient, making the conversion from renewable power to hydrogen and back to heat. And so we're going to have limited supply for decades. And so we need to reserve it for difficult to decarbonize sectors. Blue hydrogen is making methane in the normal way and then capturing the CO2 and locking it underground in this unproven process. Some studies suggest it's worse than coal for warming. And even if those are slightly overplayed, because, well, I won't go into the detail, it's not good, and it's listed as gas. It's being pushed heavily by fossil fuel companies as a route to continue their gas extraction operations, and by the gas distribution network people and boiler companies. 84% of clean hydrogen capacity under development in the UK is blue hydrogen. And there's a shocking scandal here. Perhaps we'll talk more about this later, but it's being held out as this green option, and it just isn't. And we're going to be paying for it as taxpayers. The government are even proposing that the taxpayer would fund the difference between the extra cost to make the blue hydrogen and to allow companies to be able to sell it at natural gas prices. So it's shocking what's going on. It looks like our policies have been written by fossil fuel companies. Alternative fuels, so-called sustainable aviation fuels, just nonsense. This is really why we must tackle climate and nature together. It's hard to think of a worse idea to use vast areas of monocrops to provide fuel for planes, leaving no room for nature or people, just at a time when we desperately need to improve food security. There were no policies in place to reduce air miles in the latest policy announcements, which is shameful. And we've reduced tax on domestic aviation at a time when other countries are banning it. So that's a nonsense. And then finally on emissions, I suspect I'm taking too long here. We support fossil fuels with £10 billion every year in taxpayer money. One particularly egregious example is where the government gives fossil fuel companies tax relief of 91 pence in every pound invested. For new developments. Now, you'd think this tax relief would be for investment in clean power, to encourage the transition, but it's not. It's only for new fossil fuels. So they're giving money back to our money, back to fossil fuel companies to drill for new oil and gas, and not for renewables. Now, I mean, that's really wrong. But looking at this chart positively, there's a big amount of money here that could be redirected. So let me just jump as quickly as I can through the nature part. The UK is in the 12 most nature depleted nations in the world. England's actually the 7th, according to the RSPB. But we're part of nature. It supplies our food, water, air, shelter, medicine. I don't need to tell you that. And we're reliant on it as ever before to mitigate climate change by absorbing carbon, but also to adapt to the worst impacts like flooding, drought, extreme heat. Sorry, let me catch up there. The new Office for Environmental Protection says that vital UK ecosystems are near tipping points, and they name causes as things like seabed trawling and pollution of land and rivers from agriculture and sewage. And they're very critical of the government. The government's new environmental improvement and plan has a target of a 10% improvement in nature by 2042. But they're measuring that as a 10% on a 2030 baseline ahead of us in time. But meanwhile, nature's collapsing and collapsing. And so that 10% up on 2030 could still be down on today. And NGOs are warning that we could see ecosystems collapse even before we get to that point. I will jump through that one. I'll do this very quickly. These are the Stockholm Resilience Centre's 9 planetary boundaries, and these are the Earth's interconnected systems, and we are breaching safe limits in all of them. And the reason for putting this up is to emphasize that climate is only one of these systems. And what's really absent in the net zero strategy is any mention of the food system, our food system. The food system has the widest destructive impact on all of these systems that have been breached. It's responsible for 20% of our emissions in the UK, and it rises to 35% of our emissions when we include imports. Farmers get a lot of the blame for damage to nature, but they are locked into the system just as we consumers are by the food giants, the supermarkets, very sophisticated marketing, pushing food that's profitable for them but unhealthy and terrible for the planet. Just 2.5% of advertising budget goes on fruit and veg, and even the food industry recognised the need for change. That's a quote there from Tesco's at the bottom. They want to change, or they say they do, but no one player can change on their own, because they'll just be competed out. It needs to be government that acts, and the government are doing nothing on it. Nature needs space and connectivity to thrive, but farmland takes up 70% of our land area. This is a representation from the National Food Strategy of how our land's used, and most of that is for livestock farming, either directly or the crops that feed the livestock. So we do grow a lot of grains, but most of them go to feed the animals, not humans. And you can see there at the top, look, fruit and vegetable area about the same as golf courses, and yet we import 50% of our vegetables and 84% of our fruit. And then the hexagons on the right are how much land we use overseas just for agriculture. So this is just completely unsustainable. So land use, the Climate Change Committee have said we need to cut meat consumption by 20% by 2030 and onwards from there. And this is the big lever. Moving towards a plant-based diet, this is one of our people who helped us with the report, gives a double carbon dividend. So you get lower emissions because plant-based food has got lower carbon footprint, but you also free up land that can help draw carbon out of the atmosphere. But you do all these other things, tackle pollution, improve food security, because you can feed 12 times more people on a plant-based diet than on meat. And no one's suggesting people aren't allowed to eat meat. It's just that we need to start cutting it. And the government's got to actually talk about that. A lot of people will help if they know, and a lot of people don't know. It'll tackle the cost of living. We're reliant on long supply chains and global food giants who act very much like the oil companies, and they've been taking advantage of Ukraine, and prices have been soaring. because we're not food sufficient. Reducing the intensity of farming means we can farm in a more nature-friendly way. There's a lot of economic benefit with jobs, nature tourism, restoring nature. It'll tackle the health crisis, which costs tens of billions a year, the leading cause of death. There's a huge well-being benefit of providing more nature for people to enjoy. Oops. And I will skip that one. Those are all the sort of chemicals and that come from farming and mostly from livestock. So then just brief last few slides. It's essential that we protect our key carbon stores, our carbon sinks, because at the moment they're unhealthy and they're giving off carbon. Now, so peatland the UK is really important globally for peatland. It stores far more carbon than tropical rainforest. At the moment, because it's degraded, it makes up 4% of UK's greenhouse gas emissions, which is huge, and most people don't realise this is an issue. The main cause is a livestock grazing, burning on shooting estates, and growing crops where we shouldn't be, draining the peatland. Restoring peatlands would bring huge economic benefits, but when there's nowhere near enough being done. Woodland, there's the government's plans for woodland, increase in woodland to 2050, that black rectangle. It's just miserably unambitious. They've actually lowered their ambition since 2021. Rewilding Britain and Friends of the Earth say that we could double our woodland. And population density is not an excuse. Belgium's 50% more population. Their density is 40 or 50% higher than ours, and look, they're far ahead. It's just because we led the world into the Industrial Revolution and, in our imperial past and all that sort of thing. Let me skip on. Water systems and seas. Oceans absorb and store more carbon and release more oxygen than any other ecosystem. And this isn't reflected in the net zero strategy. Pollution in water systems and industrial fishing is creating dead zones that are unable to absorb carbon. Bottom trawling releases more CO2 than aviation. The point about Lyme Bay at the bottom there is that if we actually pull back and still allow line caught fishing, fish stocks increase very rapidly, and that's helping recover the ecosystems, which can then start locking up carbon again. You saw before the impact overseas of our food consumption. This is impact of 6 or 7 key commodities. That's how much land area we use overseas. So we're using well over twice our own land area for our consumption, and we just can't go on like this. This is why the Climate and Ecology Bill has provisions for taking responsibility for our overseas footprint. So very briefly, the Climate and Ecology Bill, which is what's the answer to all of this? What this country is lacking is an overarching mission statement. We've got bitty policies here and there. We haven't got any overarching mission statement that ties together climate and nature. And what great thing was ever achieved without a big ambition that was set out to drive it? We're also lacking any sort of signal to the markets, businesses and individuals that the government's serious. We're getting these stop-start policies. Who's going to invest in building up their supply chains when a year later the rug gets pulled out from under your feet and all the funding goes? You need to lock something in law. That's what the C Bill does. So it would require that we reverse the destruction of nature, turning things round on health of ecosystems and all that sort of thing by 2030, and then pushing on back upwards. We'll never get to where we were originally, but we can improve things far, to a level far above where they are now. Commit to a carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. I can talk about how that works more in detail if you want later. Even if the rest of the world doesn't do it, we can do it. We were the first into this. We can help show the way out. And tackle climate and nature together because they're interlinked. Take responsibility for our international impacts on emissions and ecology, and consult the public. We won't bring people together and and persuade people to all start acting unless they feel consulted, unless they feel heard. It's no use just applying top-down diktats. So there's a provision to hold a citizens' assembly, and there was a very limited scope version of that run by some parliamentary committees in 2020, which actually showed that the concept worked really well, and it's used all over the world with great success. So there we go. That's me done. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't ramble on too much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. My goodness, a lot of things to absorb there. If people have questions, would you mind putting your hand up in from the reactions, and I'll try and keep an eye on that. From the reactions part of the oh, I don't know, the screen at the bottom. So John, I saw John's hand first and then Caroline. So over to you, John. I think you're muted right now.
Maybe for the best. Just a very quick one, please. Simon, could we have the link to your presentation, please?
Sure thing. I'll share it with Jessica, and after this, it's not online yet, and it will be. I'll upload it, and if you open it online, it opens as a Google Slides presentation, and the formatting might be a bit funny, but you can also download it as its original format, which is PowerPoint, and run it in a way that might appear better. So, just a little proviso there.
We also will be, I think you were here to hear this, John. We will be putting it in the morning, the webinar onto our YouTube channel. So it will be available to refresh your mind on certain aspects. Over to Caroline.
Oh, thank you, Simon. So depressing, but it's good to hear again. I try to avoid it. I've gone into mitigation and adaptation personally, so I understand it from a personal point of view, how hard it is to change. Done a lot of work with catalyzers as well. So I've got questions that are kind of maybe minority questions, but maybe not. I don't know. Is this the first time I'm hearing, it was the beginning of your presentation, that climate change damaged nature and affects biodiversity? So we've always looked at carbon emissions being the source of everything. So for me, that's a missing link if we say climate change damages nature. Do you know what I mean? It's like we're missing the source of the problem somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it's effectively the climate's changing too quickly for species to adapt by, moving more, northwards and that sort of thing. And these ecosystems that hold a lot of carbon, they depend on the creatures that live within them to stay healthy. And if those creatures die, the ecosystems die, and then they start giving up a lot more carbon. So it's really critical that we provide space and we provide connectivity now, whilst there's to give them every help they can.
Yeah, I'd love to have more information on the sources of methane. It's obviously something that's been talked a lot about. So I'm just saying that was an amazing presentation. I'd love to hear more, literally. And the last thing I was going to ask you is the history of the fossil fuel subsidies. We did a lot of work with the fossil fuel companies as XR catalyzers, and we talked to many of them. But I still don't understand the history of it, because the whole thing is mad, completely mad, But what are the triggers for this system to be in place? Because this is the key thing. The money's going in the wrong place, literally.
I'll just back up there a minute. The best place to look at this is the OECD's information on fossil fuel subsidies, which is linked from our report. And I should just note that some of these not all of these subsidies go to the fossil fuel companies. Some of them go to the public in terms of like reduced VAT on heating oil and that sort of thing. And the government will say, well, it's important that we support people. We can't have pensioners cold in their homes. But there are different ways of providing that support. And if you offer that support by reducing the fossil fuel price, you're simply distorting the market. And the Conservatives are supposed to be advocates of a free market. So you're distorting it, and you're preventing people from making the right choice and investing to move to heat pumps and insulating their homes. Give them the support another way. But the government denies that's the number 10 billion, but that's just outright denial, because that's an OECD number. And I mean, how do we change it? You know, that's why I'm moving more into the political realm, and feel that we've got to have a change in government at the next election, or we're in deep trouble.
I will just quickly say, Richard is Simon's being very nice, and he's being very subtle. I will say it bluntly, Caroline, if you will allow me. Fossil fuel companies donate to the Conservative Party. May I leave it at that, or shall I expand?
John, I'm going to stop you jumping in on my facilitation there. But I mean, it was very clear from Simon's presentation that it's not just the fossil fuel companies, but they're in there having a malign influence, so integrated into the system. But also I found really interesting the house building as well. Nobody really talks about that. Why are we building houses that aren't fit for our future? But please don't jump in like our naughty John Bedina from Steve Baker would. But we love you, John. Thank you for being here. So over to Jules now, and then following on to Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk, Simon. I have a very quick question for you. You said at the beginning of your talk that you had sent out a pack to all to all MPs as a hard copy. Can you tell me roughly when that was sent, please?
December, January
of this year.
Yeah, yeah.
December, right.
Yeah.
That's it. That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lisa.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Simon. That was great. I have two quick questions, actually. The first one is it all right to use bits of your presentation? I'm a A-level geography teacher, and there's better stuff on those slides than I've seen in most lessons for a long time. So if you don't mind, that'd be great.
I'd love that, and I know 0 Hour will be happy, more than happy. So thank you.
Fab.
Can I just come back on the home point and say, I think it's a really useful thing to know that in 2008, the government, the then Labour government, introduced something called the Code for Sustainable Homes, and I really knew about this because I was running a manufacturing company in the building sector, and we all knew that all homes had to, by 2016, become completely zero carbon. And that was legally binding, and everyone was working towards it. But in 2015, after lobbying from Persimmon Homes, the Conservative government completely cancelled that legislation. And so that means that anyone who has bought a new house from 2016 onwards, built with terrible standards, poor insulation, gas boiler, is paying, bills that they shouldn't be having to pay, because these zero carbon homes will be almost free to heat. And they're going to have to shell out, hopefully with grant support, to retrofit those homes and have all that disruption. So it's a shocking thing, and these things tend to get forgotten. And that was something that happened because again, government was prioritizing the power of big business over what's sensible to do.
Thank you. I hadn't realized that. I feel angry. Lisa, I think you had another question as well.
Yeah, sorry, it was just a quick one. You mentioned at the end the climate and ecology bill, and I've been trying to find out a bit more about where it's got to, and I found it really hard to find anything on that. And when I met with Suella Braverman in January, I asked her about it. And she basically said it was pointless to support it because it wouldn't go anywhere. So I'd love to have something to go back at her on with that, or to know what is actually happening to it?
I think what I should do is ask the team just to do a very short summary, maybe to distribute to you all. But in broad terms, it's a private members bill. It was, you know, Caroline Lucas was behind it at first. It's got MPs from all parties behind it, and it was recently retabled in the Commons. It gets retabled every year, and then it just drops, and it gets retabled and drops. It's just as it's the mechanics of Parliament. And this latest time, it had 4 MPs tabled it, including a Conservative, which is really important because we've got to have cross-party consensus, or at least some, as much as we can get. Can it become law? Yes, it absolutely can, because the Climate Change Act that we're operating under now started out life exactly the same way as private members bill in 2005. And then in 2008, it became law because the government decided to get behind it. So it's as simple as that. It might not be in the form it's in now, but it's simply acting as a kind of flag in the ground. It's like sort of an unmovable set of demands that are necessary to enact if we want to actually do this properly. So yeah, I'll send something out, just a short summary. But thank you, thanks for pushing that with Suella.
Thank you.
I'm going to let myself ask a question now. So, Simon, interesting and depressing to see these facts and to be updated on where we are with them. How does your work relate to the Skidmore report that Liz was probably the only good thing that came out of Truss's short term as the Prime Minister?
That's a good question. We looked at the Skidmore report in detail, and it's got some really great stuff in the top section of the report, all the broad words and everything. Read down to the mechanics, and they don't tackle anything. They've still got reliance on carbon capture, blue hydrogen, BECCS, and it barely tackles anything. It throws up questions, and I think what the Skidmore report actually does achieve is it's fighting the regressive elements in the Conservative Party who are trying to backslide from the existing commitments. It's not ratcheting up the existing commitments and then tackling the ambition gap. So it was more about tackling the one on top, the delivery gap.
And as a sort of follow-on question, I very welcome, please put your hand up if you half have a question and you're sort of daring yourself. Please, now is the time to put your hand up. But I mean, it doesn't look really like any of the political parties that have a chance of ruling are going to have policies fit for purpose. How are you feeling about that, and how do we begin to address it? I mean, obviously MP Watch has its own approach, which you're taking part in as well, but how are, you know, having looked at this very broad integrated potential policy with nature and climate tied up together, how are we going to be able to move forward?
Well, first of all, the Green Party obviously do have the right policies in place, and the Lib Dems do, because they completely back the Climate and Ecology Bill. All of them do. A lot of SNP MPs do. And lately, a couple of weeks ago, Ed Miliband tweeted out that Labour now support the aims and objectives of the CE Bill, which is sort of one step towards. And he did get some criticism from, I think, Rupert Reed, trying to push him to go further, rightly. But these things have to be done by steps, I think, in Labour. I think it's a more difficult challenge for them to come behind it. They on the environment and nature side, they have Alex Sobel, who's really good. He's saying and doing all the right things. It's just a question of persuading them to commit to the Climate and Ecology Bill in their manifesto. And if they do, you know, it really could be made law. And it would be an extraordinary thing if the CE Bill was made law. it would create you know, a transformative revolution. It would force us legally to move ourselves on a wartime footing, and it would set a blueprint for other developed nations to follow. You know, it really would. You know, it would show companies that were serious, and it would set off so much. The challenge is getting Labour to commit to something that's not their own bill, that's a cross-party bill. And I know the 0 Hour are having a big campaign to try and reach all Labour members, Labour councillors, and ask them to put pressure on the executive to put it into the manifesto. And I'm optimistic that there is, I don't think it's highly likely, but there's definitely a reasonable chance of it.
Okay, interesting. I've got follow-on questions, but I don't want to keep hogging. Leslie, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. It's a question about degrowth and housing, because it's really hard to bring people on board with the idea of green growth and building fewer houses. And I wonder what outreach there may have been towards organisations like Shelter and housing poverty groups to kind of maybe switch the narrative from building more houses to bringing existing houses into better use. And if anybody's initiated anything like that in Parliament.
That's a really good question, but it's not an area I know too much about. I know there's also an organisation called Action on Second Homes or Empty Homes that I've been in touch with, and they're very good, shining a light on this. But there's just not enough talk about it. The only way to head off, really serious climate change is we've got to bring these second homes back into use, and that means tackling wealthy second homers who are often Tory donors. So that's a thorny issue. But no, sorry, I'm not too up on the detail there. One thing I should say, Jessica, you talked about, a few people have said this is depressing where we are. The frustration is that there is still, quite an exciting future ahead of us. There's overwhelming science now that's showing that 100% renewables-based power system is feasible, and people might think, well, how can it work at night, and how can it work on a sort of windless winter week? But there are countless studies. There's a meta study showing that all independent studies are now showing that this is possible, and it would offer really big savings, really quick payback. One very thorough study looked at 145 countries, and they looked at the power data for 3 years down to 30-second data points. And they worked out that a lot of the natural variation in solar and etc. is ironed out by coupling lots of sources of renewables together. So wind and solar tend to peak at different times, and then you've got wave, tidal, hydro, geothermal. And what they showed is that by mixing all these things together, and then by connecting countries together so surpluses can be shared, so if it's windy up in Orkney or sunny down in the Bay of Biscay, you can iron the vast majority of the variation out, and then you deal with night times, etc., with by offsetting demand by using smart meters to encourage people to charge cars at different times and all that sort of thing. So you've got home batteries, you've got pumped hydro storage, and then the bit that you have to do with grid batteries isn't that big, and there's some people on the internet talking about, oh, how we'd have to have batteries that would provide 2 weeks of reserve supply. But it's just not true when you look at the data. UK, they modeled UK with Europe, so we would be self-sufficient inside Europe, no longer reliant on any of these fossil fuel dictators. And it's a really exciting future. There are some resource issues, yes. I've talked to Kevin Anderson about this, and he's very much of the view that we can do it resource-wise. We've just got to stop wasting resources on giant SUVs and all the other private jets. We're going to have to have legislation
That is really exciting to hear, Simon. So if you get any links to that kind of material, please share in our national group, because I'd really love to see that. It does seem to me quite bewildering that we're so close. You know, it sounds like from what you've said that we're there, but we've been so close to being able to integrate this, but the government is like, we're really close to this. Let's invest in carbon capture. It's like, what? But there's this project that, you know, and you just can't imagine Apple or one of those, you know, people when they were very technically close to finding a solution, just wanting something distracting. If it weren't in the fossil fuels interest for us to be distracted, and you can't help but see that bigger agenda behind it, and I mean, but that's a different sort of discussion. Well, we've just gone over the 11:30 mark, and we did say that that this webinar would take an hour. I'd like to really thank you, Simon, for your time and energy in helping and informing us. I think this has been a very valuable exercise, and I can see lots of nodding heads for that. So maybe as a sort of, oh, I don't know, as a goodbye, we could all open our, unmute ourselves and give Simon a round of applause. I'm going to do that anyway.
Well, that's very kind of you, and thank you all for everything you're doing. And I think we're all fighting the same battle here, aren't we? You know.
Yes, no, absolutely. And we think of you as one of us, Simon.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, lovely to see you all. And I'm sure we'll see each other again soon.
Yes. Okay. Take care. And thank you, Tom, for covering the technical side of things.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.